So welcome again, and thank you to everyone for attending our webinar today. This is the first of our replanned new series of webinars looking at how to actually integrate biodiversity into various daily activities and business decision-making processes. But before we start, I do have a little bit of housekeeping to go through. Firstly, to point out that the webinar is being recorded and it will be made available on our YouTube channel within a few days. We will also be sharing the link with everyone who registered for the webinar in the coming days too. Secondly, I would like to encourage you to post any of your questions in the chat box, and I will address as many of them at the end of the presentation as I can. Please note also that for the purpose of brevity, please rather submit questions in writing, as we will not really have time for participants to join the conversations to ask the questions themselves. And while I see some familiar faces today, there are also some people who are new to our webinars. So as a start, let me just briefly introduce myself and endangered wildlife. So my name is Dr. Shana Gavron, and I'm the CEO of Endangered Wildlife. I have a joint background in both finance and conservation, with about 15 years experience as a senior sell-side institutional equity analyst, and have been working on solutions for biodiversity finance for the past 2 decades. One of the biggest challenges that I've seen over the last many years is that there is a lack of common language between the world of finance and the world of conservation. And it's this gap that endangered wildlife has been trying to bridge for the last 5-6 years by converting the complex concept of biodiversity into a more common universal language of money. So in saying that, Endangered Wildlife is a consulting and software development company working with the financial valuation of both individual species and richness to help facilitate this process of literally integrating biodiversity into any form of decision making. And this is what we plan to address today by looking at a practical case study where we directly integrate biodiversity into a property development financial analysis. And you may be thinking, well, how is it actually possible to integrate or incorporate biodiversity into financial analysis when financial analysis is about finance? And yes, that is true. Financial analysis requires finance. But what we've learned to do is to actually transition biodiversity into finance also by considering the various characteristics of a species or the richness. You can actually start to calculate the financial value of biodiversity based on the contributions it makes regionally to society, to the economy, and to the environment. And the way that we actually approach this is using the sum of the parts. So instead of thinking about a species as an animal or plant, imagine it as something like a portfolio of diversified investments. The portfolio can include things like carbon investments, aesthetic investments, economic investments, hedge investments, and impact investments. Each of these will have their own characteristics and values, but they all contribute to the greater or whole portfolio. Some portfolio will only be made up of carbon, and some perhaps will only have impact. But each portfolio has a value based on the sum of its different parts and of the actual portfolio attributes. With the only difference being between the species and the portfolio in this analogy is that the species is the portfolio. And it's through its actual natural activities and existence that it starts to create the equivalence of a portfolio value. So when looking at biodiversity, it's not only about valuing an animal or plant, is actually valuing a diversified portfolio of multiple asset classes, taking various risk exposures into account. And as per any sort of portfolio, each segment is valued based on publicly available information and data. So we will always say you'll never get that perfect valuation. You never have perfect knowledge. The same way as when you're busy valuing a portfolio or individual companies, you never have that private inside information. So with that in mind, let's start taking a look at the actual practical application of putting biodiversity directly into financial analysis. And this is not a carbon credit and valuation, is not a biodiversity credit valuation. is actually a financial valuation of integrating biodiversity into the net asset value and return on investment on a project assessment based on the case study that we did back in 2023. So within that case study, we were starting to consider this idea of let's create a residential property development in Norway. This is not an actual development that occurred, but it was based on the property market prices at the time of evaluation and based on the actual real Norwegian market averages at the time of back in 2023. The property we were looking at was 11 hectares of mixed habitat with forest, woodlands, grasslands, and also access to natural waterways. We decided that we'd develop 32 high-end luxury houses of around 200 square meter surface area, each with their own 1,000 square meter plot of land. And as a developer, we would also be responsible to effectively lay all the infrastructure, carry out all the landscaping, and maintain the property going forward. In addition, the advert for the land mentioned that it is already rich in biodiversity, and while there was no survey, based on the actual location and habitat type, we superimposed certain species and determined that it could be inhabited by species such as Arctic wolves, beavers, lemmings, red deer, and roe deer. That was basically, I say, by overlapping or overlaying the distribution maps of these species relative to the property location and also taking into account the habitat preferences of each of the species. So one thing that we know, and we've seen this trend occurring, is more and more home buyers are beginning to prioritize eco-friendly homes and sustainable building practices. And investors themselves are looking to improve their own profiles when considering property market investments. So we were thinking about, well, if we were to prepare this 11 hectare property for development, we have to now make an important decision. Do we follow the traditional route of clearing the land and preparing a nice landscaped manicured garden? Or do we rather keep the natural assets to integrate and promote the presence of biodiversity? And this is quite a vital decision that needs to be made upfront. And at the time when we were looking at this, the CDB was saying that changing land use is one of the most significant factors impacting Norwegian biodiversity. And it was most likely to have a negative impact on 87% of the already threatened and near threatened species. So one of the suggested adaptation strategies was to actually secure corridors of large habitats with climate gradients and protect those already threatened species. But for many developers, this can become a difficult decision. While they're aware of the fact that buyers are shifting their behaviors, according to a previous study that was done, biodiversity is one of the most complex issues to implement. Market players do not know how to address it in a concrete and pragmatic manner. Moreover, they consider that there is a lack of harmonized approach and guidelines. And while this was a few years ago, I think it very much holds true even to today. But at a high level, what is known is that when you follow a traditional route with manicuring your gardens, you will automatically be displacing naturally occurring biodiversity due to the changes in habitat. You're obviously incurring landscaping and gardening capex plus the maintenance costs. And you will be unnecessarily increasing your carbon footprint for the development. Comparatively, if you were to start to actually integrate biodiversity into the property development, from one side, you're not destroying as much habitat, and therefore you're retaining and encouraging biodiversity to stay. You're able to start to reduce that landscaping and gardening capex and the maintenance costs, and thereby actually reducing the carbon footprint of the development. You can start to actually increase the green image of the development and attract the eco-conscious buyers without greenwashing the activities, and effectively using a methodology like I mentioned previously, you can start to calculate a biodiversity net asset value and return on investment. So now suddenly we have a way to address all of those challenges of how to actually consider biodiversity in a very concrete and pragmatic way for developers and investors alike. So in order to do this direct comparison of the two strategic choices, let's go back to the very basics. When you do an assessment of a property development and the feasibility of it, you look at returns using a discounted cash flow model. So this is the approach that was taken when considering the scenario. The Norwegian property market, due to limited supply at the time, was experiencing a rise in housing prices. Additionally, considering the fact that ESG was becoming a new normal in the Nordics, there was about 75% of investors already adopting the ESG criteria in their decision-making process. So we believe that this was something that could have continued going forward and potentially intensifying. It was also assumed that the project would be breaking ground and initiating the construction of the houses and infrastructure in 2024, with the first completed houses available for sale in 2025. And even though it would be an exclusive development, that there would be a gradual uptake of the houses and the houses would be sold out by 2030. Now, these base assumptions remain consistent for both the traditional scenario, which is a clear land scenario, and the integrate biodiversity scenario. The difference, though, being that the traditional clear land scenario requires increased landscaping design and implementation, along with more active gardening and maintenance services. Based on these assumptions, it is estimated that the cumulative net profit for the development was 8.1 million euros, leaving an NAV of 1.1 million. But as a development, it's necessary not only to be looking at financial prospects, considering important climate changes at the moment. So one should consider the fact that if you're to have an immaculate manicured garden, there are other things to be considered, such as equipment and supplies for maintaining the gardens. So just to have the lawns in pristine condition, you'd be looking at applying chemicals, which on average produce 135 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per acre per year. You've got the irrigation systems, which besides the water consumption, produces 231 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per year. And of course, you need to start using things like mowers, which for 1 hour of mowing produces 11 times the emissions of driving an average new car for an hour, with over 425 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per acre per year. And on top of that, you've got to start thinking about things such as petrol hedges, edges, and saws. And leaf blowers alone, focusing on those, besides the noise and the particles in the air, 1 hour of leaf blower equates to the CO2 equivalent emissions of driving a car almost 1,800 kilometers. So this is something that's not really good to be ignored. In comparison, if we were to start to look at the case for biodiversity, we have the option here to do a richness valuation, or instead we decided to focus on 5 species that we had valued already in 2021. As you can see, the baseline valuations vary quite significantly. However, based on the habitat types of the property and the size of the property that can be set aside as a natural habitat garden, is estimated against average densities per hectare that there would be sufficient land to support 2 Arctic foxes, 1 red deer, 2 roe deers, 4 beavers, and 330 lemmings. The lemmings are particularly important also for the Arctic foxes, as they are one of the main food sources. So this is why it starts to become so important to actually understand and recognize how interrelated species are and the need to ensure there is a balanced and healthy ecosystem in the area. Additionally, these species contribute not only to maintaining healthy ecosystems, but they also perform important services to society. For example, we know beavers are vital ecosystem engineers. They modify and maintain habitats, and they also create new habitats, for example, to promote insects that become food for fish. The Arctic fox may raise a few questions because of it being a predator, but they are deemed to be harmless to humans unless they are under threat. Naturally, there would need to be a rabies vaccination protocol implemented to ensure that there is no sort of risk of rabies. And it would be necessary to explain to residents as part of the requirements or protocol of the development that you have to be respectful to all species, both plants and animals, because they are wild, and a certain distance needs to be maintained to avoid any sort of disturbance. But if we were to then start to look at the integration of biodiversity scenario using the same DCF process, we can see there is quite a stark difference. The same as said, base assumptions are held. The only difference is the garden is not being landscaped, it's not being manicured. Only about 5 hectares, half of it would be, so 5 hectares would still remain as natural gardens. So as a result, you do not have that need for or the cost for landscaping or gardeners. Instead, you need to include a forest manager to manage the natural areas. At the same time, the natural gardens are able to actually care for themselves, reducing that negative impact on CO2 emissions. And based on these assumptions, you can now see there's now a net profit which has increased to 8.7 million euros and an NAV of 1.6 million euros. So now that we've actually done all the numbers, you can actually start, to me, looking at what I think is the more interesting of the slides, which is the comparative analysis between the two scenarios, where you've got the clear land being the traditional way of doing things and the integrate biodiversity being the one where you leave 5 hectares remained untouched. So if we look at the key numbers, under both scenarios, you have the same number of sales and with a cumulative value of about 45 million euros, where all 32 houses are sold between 2025 and 2030. And as discussed, you can start to see we've got an increase in net profit from 8.1 million to 8.6, 8.7 million. As a result, the biodiversity option now starts to increase margins by some 130 basis points to 19.1%. And with all other factors being held constant, the NAV now increases from 1.1 million to 1.6 million. That is probably where a normal property development analyst would be able to reach. Even though that alone clearly demonstrates that added value of directly integrating biodiversity into property development. But here's where we can actually take things one step further by placing the biodiversity into the analysis. The valuation of the species equates to an implicit NAV that is created by not displacing the individuals. When the species are displaced, you're effectively creating zero biodiversity value. In that those individuals are no longer there. They're no longer supported and maintained, and they're no longer under the custodianship of the developer. Whereas if you leave some land untouched and allow for a symbiotic relationship between on the land between both humans and species, we are now allowing the development to retain that biodiversity NAV. We are creating a positive impact by not displacing the species and by encouraging the presence of them. We are thereby providing new habitat and contributing towards their sustained survival. This cumulative NAV across the 5 species about 4 million euros, which means suddenly we can calculate a return on investment for the development, which is already about 210 basis points higher, and actually integrate biodiversity into that ROI. The biodiversity ROI on its own is around 12%, which is calculated or defined as the biodiversity NAV relative to the investment made in the property. So as a final valuation of the two scenarios, if we start to consider PM-PID market cap values, then we can say that the average NAV price to NAV at the time was about 0.6 times. So under the traditional scenario, you'd be looking at a market cap of about 0.6 million. Whereas if you start to integrate biodiversity and consider the biodiversity NAV itself, you'd be looking at a market cap of about 3.6 million. So it starts to become quite easy to demonstrate that making a simple choice of integrating biodiversity and using the natural assets of a piece of land within a property development can significantly increase the financial value for that development. It reduces costs, increases profit margins, increases returns to investors, allows you to retain and enhance that environment, so it becomes an actionable green policy rather than greenwashing or offsetting. And ultimately, you're no longer just maximizing returns to shareholders, you're also doing so to the environment. So critical corridors can easily be created, and biodiversity can be directly integrated into that financial analysis to justify that integration or creation of the corridors, so that it no longer becomes an expense, it starts to become a financial benefit. And this is what stakeholders need to begin to recognize, that we are all integrated with biodiversity. And as such, biodiversity needs to be recognized as a vital asset to companies and as a global and local economic citizen. And you may be thinking, well, how can you actually do this for yourselves? And this is where we come in effectively. We provide that range of services for the development of corporate biodiversity strategies, all the way through to richness valuations to facilitate and assist with integrating biodiversity into the financial analysis, through to things like customized biodiversity for business training. So if you'd like to discuss any of these solutions and learn more about how we can help you navigate this complex environment, you're welcome to reach out to us or send a private message on the chat box. But for now, I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. And thank you very much for attending and your attention. As if you, and I'll reiterate this, if you want to learn more, or if you'd like to receive a copy of the case study,